Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Check out the new angle of the flat. Today we are going to be talking about one of my favourite parts of my degree, and that is effectively reading scientific papers and journal articles. I am currently researching for my biological psychology presentation that we are giving on the 4th of April, and my group and I have decided to centre our presentation around hemispheric lateralisation and split brain research. If you did A-level psychology, you'll know about Sperry. Love him to death. And I'm actually reading his papers right now, which is something I've never done. Despite studying him very intensely at A-level, we never actually got to read his paper firsthand. And scientific papers are daunting as hell. You don't really get taught how to read them. At least I certainly didn't at A-level or at university. That may be different wherever you are or wherever you are going to be. But I thought this would be a good little insight into how I personally read papers best. Before I get stuck into the journal article, I thought I would speak a little bit about which iPad I use. I use the iPad Air 3. It is the 2019 edition. So by Apple standards, this is a pretty outdated model, but I was looking into iPad Pros because they seem to be all the rage right now, especially with study tubers and study blurs. And personally, I think if you just want an iPad that is good for note-taking and academics, an iPad Air 3 will serve you fine. This has been my baby for nearly 3 years and I have never had a single problem with it. Enough about the iPad. Let's talk about what I actually use to annotate and read my journal articles. I use GoodNotes 5, which will probably come as a shock to nobody because every single study tuber and study blur on the planet uses GoodNotes 5. I know several people who will print off their journal articles and read them that way. I know a lot of people who will use their laptops. Any way of reading them is fine as long as you are reading your journal articles. But for me, I like to download my PDFs and put them into GoodNotes 5. So let's actually get into the app and have a look at the paper I am currently reading. It is called Hemisphere Deconnection and Unity in Conscious Awareness by Roger Sperry. As I said, if you know psychology at all, you are probably very familiar with Roger Sperry. This is not the paper he is most famous for. This paper actually comes after that one. It is a bit of a follow-up really, and I thought I'd start with this one first because this is one of his experiments that I am not familiar with. Here is the document. As you can see, it is 11 pages long, and you can see I've started to make some notes at the end, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Let's go back and start with page 1. As you can see at the top of the paper, I have got a little key which will help me distinguish what each of my highlighter colours mean throughout this document. So we have key information, further research, methodologies and observations, results and unfamiliar terminology. Your key can include absolutely anything because a lot of people will be reading papers for very, very different reasons. But for me, I need these ones. As you can see on this first slide, there is a lot of key information because this paper is very, very meaty, but also fantastic. I would highly recommend reading it. I will link it in the description because I know how to YouTube. If we take a little zoom in, you can see that I have got quite a lot of key information just in this first paragraph, but I also have a little annotation here. Now, if you don't study biology or psychology or neuroscience, you may not know what the fornix is. It's an area in the brain. And the reason I have this written here is because a lot of the terminology in this paper is now outdated and areas of the brain now go by slightly different names. So the hippocampal commissures are now known as the fornix. The reason I have got this here is because when I come back to this paper for writing up my presentation, I don't want to be sitting there and deciphering a load of terminology that is no longer commonly used. So having that there, I can just immediately see, okay, it's the phonics, and put that into my presentation. I'm being kind to myself in the future. Then we have our first highlighted instance of further research. Having this highlighted does not necessarily mean I am going to be reading every single one of these studies or papers. This simply allows me to have options for additional things to read regarding this paper. If there is something I come back to later and realise I think I need to know more about this, then I have the name of the experimenters and the year the research was published right there. Obviously, you can use the references at the end of a paper for this, but for me, I find the reference list really, really daunting because there's usually quite a lot in there. So having this within the document directly above what information it is concerning is super useful for me. But again, everything is different. Please don't take how I read academic papers and interpret them as gospel. Everyone's got their own ways of doing it, and every single way is fantastic, as long as you are reading your papers. Let's have a look at the next page. So here we have some more annotations. Let's have a little zoom in. The reason for annotations such as this is because a lot of papers, I would say particularly pre-1980, are very wordy and use a lot of outdated jargon, as I was saying before. But not just in terms of anatomical terminology, sometimes just the general wording is very, very long-winded and, by today's standards, unnecessary. So this entire passage, you can see, is summed up by the initial view of the scientific community prior to this study. So if I decide that in my presentation I would like to talk about what the scientific climate was surrounding this issue before Sperry's research, I can see it right here because I have annotated it for me. And as I say, future Lewis is going to appreciate this a lot when it comes to crunch time. And even down here we have the fact that Sperry's research very heavily contradicted the earlier findings. That's going to be really useful for me because sometimes it can be a little bit of a disagreement, but in this case, Sperry completely flipped the pre-established views on its head because he was just that kind of guy. Let's go on to page 3. This is where it gets a lot more meaty. And this is where the results key comes in, because my primary take from these papers will be the findings, because when you present scientific presentations, you're not actually meant to put reams and reams of writing on your slides. You are meant to keep it very concise and straight to the point. Having the peripheral knowledge allows me to answer questions that will be asked at the end of the presentation. But the stuff in purple is the most vital for the presentation itself. So here we have my lovely little dusky purple colour with some of the key findings from each variation of Sperry's experiments, because he did quite a few for this paper. We also have our first instance of unfamiliar terminology. I haven't actually highlighted this one yet because sometimes I slip up, you know? If you know what this word means without Googling it, gold star to you and a round of applause, because I looked at this and didn't have a clue. So I did a little Google and then realised it actually just means a person who has had their corpus callosum separated. That's all it means. Again, a lot of technical jargon that at this level of my degree I don't need to use. And if I did use, it would be very, very obvious that I am just copying the study verbatim, which is not the point of presenting scientific findings in a presentation. So I have the little definition to the side there, annotated, ready to go, just in case I come back to this paper read that word and go, what the hell is that? Then if we go just above, we can see that I have also annotated about the emphasis on the lack of communication between the left and right hemispheres. That is essentially what this entire chunk of text here means. Then we have another diagram that is within the paper. I am quite a visual person, but I am easily confused by technical diagrams. So I have just used my highlighter colours to fully illustrate the paths in which the visual fields take into the hemispheres. As much as I know that in theory, I struggle to visualize it, so having this here is going to be incredibly useful, which also explains my tiny little diagram here, because in this section here they are discussing a $sign and a question mark being presented in the visual fields, and that is just a little visualization of that. And now we get to page 4, where the technical jargon really steps up. There are a lot of words in this section that I don't necessarily understand yet, which is completely fine, just an additional little Google for me. Here is one example, which I again have not highlighted. Googled? Am I okay? Am I okay, guys? I don't think I am. Again, if you knew what this word meant without Googling it, congratulations, but I did not. Turns out it just means that this instance of their experiment was likely to happen by chance and not an intentional finding of the study. Sperry, I really wish you could have just put that. It would have been a lot easier for me 40 years down the line. Here are some properly established uses of terminology that I don't understand, where I've actually highlighted these ones. Claps for me. So I did not know what the word stereognostic meant or somesthetic, purely because I was not using my brain properly. Turns out somesthetic is just another word for somatosensory, and that is a word I do know, and I am probably going to get confused by that word again because I have the brain capacity of a goldfish apparently. So I have put the definition right at the bottom of the page here for ease of access, because this is what pre-reading papers is all about, is ease of access for when you actually need the information. That's as far as I have gotten with this paper so far. I know there are a lot of people who would find reading an entire scientific paper too much or too daunting, but for me and the level of detail I have to go in about these experiments, it's kind of necessary for me to read this in depth. But if you are reading a paper that has very clearly outlined abstracts and results and discussion and conclusion sections, honestly, I would recommend, if you don't need to know all of the methodology and things like that, just read the abstract, the discussion, and the conclusion. You will figure out everything you need to know about that paper from those 3 sections. That's a little hack from me. But if we go to the end of the document to my very, very unfinished notes section, this is how I'm going to summarize things at the end. So I'm not just sitting and passively highlighting the document, because as much as the key is useful, it's not the most active process. So I'm going to start breaking it down into notes. We have these little brain diagrams here so that I can see exactly which areas of the brain are cut for these experiments. I should clarify, they did not cut people's corpus callosums entirely to do this experiment. The reason the corpus callosums was severed, if you don't know, is because they believed it was the most effective way to manage very severe epilepsy that was not being controlled by medication. Having these diagrams here is going to be a huge help for my presentation, because we need to demonstrate that we understand not just the studies themselves, but the biology behind it. So being able to demonstrate that we are perfectly aware of which specific areas are severed in these experiments is going to be vital for me. I completely understand that scientific papers are not everyone's cup of tea if you're just reading them for fun, or you may not be studying science at university, so you do not need to know how to read a scientific paper. But if there's one piece of advice you can take from this, is to make summary pages at the end of your documents, whether that be online or on a bit of paper. Break it all down into sizable chunks that you yourself can perfectly read and understand. Use terminology that you 100% know and are fully aware of what the definitions are, especially if you are going to be giving a presentation, because if you use a big long chunk of technical jargon, your seminar leader or the audience, whoever you are presenting to, will pull you up on that to make sure you fully understand what you are talking about. Plus, having to decipher all the technical jargon and write it down in terminology you understand is an active process. You are actively learning the information being presented to you, and you will remember it better and with a lot more ease. Trust me on that. And that is the end of my little tour on how I read my scientific papers. Let's get back to the usual setup so that I can outro this video properly. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch this video. It is massively, massively appreciated. If you took anything from what I said, or you just liked listening to me ramble about scientific papers for 16 minutes, please do give this video a thumbs up and comment down below what is the most effective way for you to read journal articles and papers, because I am always welcome to different tips and little niche ways to get the job done. And don't forget to subscribe. Please subscribe to the channel. It really, really helps me out. I will see you next Sunday. Bye guys.